At the company dinner, the world stopped. Not because of some extraordinary achievement, but because of the dry sound of a forced, disgusting, unexpected kiss that interrupted the clinking of cutlery, froze the fake smiles of my colleagues and turned my breath into a dagger stuck in my throat. My wife's boss, the same one that, for months, I pretended not to notice by staring too much, praising too much, being too present, took her by force from my side. A kiss. Given as if I didn't exist. As if she were his. And the worst part? She didn't pull away. She didn't push. She didn't scream. She froze for a second, looked at me with a guilt that didn't fit on the 4-meter-long table, and lowered her eyes. Everyone was speechless. Everyone. Except me. At that moment, something died inside me. It wasn't just love, because love had probably been poisoned for months, but it was respect. Mine, for her. Everyone else's, for me. Because no one said a word. Not her. Not him. Not the idiot who had been toasting next to us minutes before, congratulating me on the new position I hadn't accepted out of love for her. Love. Damned word. I didn't explode. Not there. Not on that stage where shame had dressed me more precisely than my tailored suit. I got up. I left. And on the way home, while the steering wheel shook under my hands and the silence crushed me, a phrase repeated in my mind like a mantra, "They will pay." But I didn't want blind revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted to show the world who they really were. The arrogant scoundrel who used his power to seduce other people's wives and the woman who once promised me fidelity while wearing the white dress I paid for. I needed proof. And more than that, I needed a plan that would destroy them from the inside. Something that would not only reveal what they had done, but that would make them taste the bitter taste of contempt. A plan worthy of what I felt: pain, humiliation, repulsion, shame, and a dry, meticulous, almost elegant fury. In the days that followed, I played their game. I smiled, as if I didn't know. I made her breakfast, as if I still loved her. I touched her waist, as if I still wanted her. And at night, I watched the cameras I had installed in the last rooms of the house, read the messages I had decoded, read and reread every, "I want you again," she typed with the same hand that caressed my face in front of the mirror. I already knew everything, but I needed the final confirmation. And it came. It came with the date, time, place. A reservation he had made. A hotel room in the city center. She swore she would work late that night. And I kissed her on the forehead before she left. The last kiss before the fall. While she undressed for another man, I dressed in courage. I gathered documents. I connected dots. I talked to the right people. The truth, when well sown, becomes a sharp weapon, and I wielded it masterfully. I not only discovered that their affair had been going on for months, but that it also involved favoritism within the company. She received bonuses that older colleagues had never dreamed of. He cut budgets for entire sectors just to maintain the image of efficiency in her department. And there was more. Much more. Things that not even she knew about. Things that, when she found out, destroyed her inside. And I made sure to deliver each one with a ribbon of irony. But the most accurate blow was not against him. It was against her. Because while he lost his job, his credibility, and his family, she lost what she said she loved most, the respect of her own family. Her parents, who are religious, were the first to cut off contact. Her sister, who had always been suspicious of her behavior, distanced herself. Her friends. Silence. What she feared most was not the end of the marriage, she believed that I would not have the courage to leave. What she feared most was being exposed. And I exposed her. But not in a cruel way. In a fair way. The truth, pure and complete, delivered in small doses. Like poison. The day she was called to testify before the company's internal committee, she called me. Crying. For the first time, really crying. She said she didn't know he did that to other people. That she thought he was special. That she didn't know the entire department was a front. That she didn't know his wife, yes, he was married, had hired a private detective. But it was too late. The house had fallen apart. Her husband knew. His wife knew. The children knew. And me? I felt strange. Because instead of relief, there was a silence inside me. As if, now, without her, I had room to breathe. The following month, I signed the divorce papers. I refused their offer of a silent agreement. They wanted me to keep quiet. They offered me money, trips, and promised that this would all pass. But I laughed. I laughed like someone who laughs at a tragedy after surviving it. I said, "You don't understand. I don't want to forget. I want the world to remember." And the world remembered. The scandal became an agenda item in meetings. The case was used in ethics training. The company launched a new internal policy based on the incident. They were not only fired. They were remembered. Stigmatized. They became an example of how not to conduct a professional and personal relationship. He lost everything. She took refuge in a friend's house, trying to rebuild a life on the pieces she herself had scattered. And me? I wasn't alone for long. Some stories end in ruins. Others, in rebirth. One day, while I was taking part in a workshop on nonviolent communication, irony of fate, I met someone. Someone who listened to me. Who didn't try to justify the pain or romanticize the mistake. Someone who didn't see me as a victim, but as someone who had courage. And there, between a lecture and a coffee, I saw something I had forgotten, a future. But there is one last thing that nobody knows. Something that was saved. A secret that was not revealed throughout the scandal. One detail. Small but explosive. Something that, if said, would completely change everyone's judgment about this story. Something only I know. Something that could turn her martyr image into an even bigger farce. And to this day, I ask myself, should I tell? Or let her live with the weight of what she thinks that I never knew? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing clear from the beginning: we do not support, encourage or romanticize any form of cheating. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but inspired by real pain, to show, without filters, how betrayal can destroy homes, families and souls. Get ready now to dive into an intense plot, full of twists and difficult truths. Press play, and hold on tight. The story you are about to hear is shocking. Jonathan had always been the kind of man who carried the world with his shoulders held high, even on days when everything inside him wanted to crumble. He was methodical, but not cold. Hard-working, but never absent. Owner of a serene look and a voice that always seemed to carry an intention of care, even in the simplest words. At 38, he had already built a solid career as a financial analyst at a respected multinational company, but, above any professional achievement, what he was most proud of was the home he had created with Elena. Meeting Elena had been like discovering that love was not made of theatrical promises, but of small routines, of silent complicity, of glances that understood each other effortlessly. She was 2 years younger, had a degree in public relations and had a natural charisma that made her memorable even after trivial conversations. Where Jonathan was introspective, Elena was expansive. Where he was prudent, she was spontaneous. And maybe that's why they worked so well. Like two opposite poles that, when they meet, form a rare point of balance. They got married after 3 years of dating, and from the beginning, Jonathan invested everything to make their marriage a refuge. He chose the house with the children they didn't have yet in mind, renovated entire rooms with his own hands to please Elena, took care of every detail of the decor, respected her space, and encouraged her dreams, even when they seemed unstable. And she, in turn, made the house a light place, full of laughter, the aroma of fresh coffee in the morning, and soft music on Sunday afternoons. Elena had a way of transforming spaces with just her presence, and Jonathan, although silent, was the one who held the foundations of that world. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where neighbors greet each other by name and children still play on the sidewalk. They didn't have children, although they had talked about it a few times. They had put off the decision for career reasons, for lack of time, perhaps because of insecurities that neither of them would admit out loud. Even so, the affection between them seemed enough. Their evenings were filled with series, simple dinners, and conversations on the couch. Weekend trips became a habit, and special dates were never forgotten. In the eyes of others, and even in their own eyes, their relationship seemed unshakable. There was comfort, partnership, and a routine that, although predictable, brought security. Jonathan liked predictability. He saw it as stability, not monotony. But Elena, even though she was grateful for what they had, sometimes let out a distant look, a breath too deep at the end of an ordinary day. She worked at a corporate events company and had been promoted months ago to the position of communications coordinator. This put her in direct contact with the company's leaders, required occasional travel, dinners with clients, and a constant presence in formal settings that contrasted with the simplicity of the home she shared with Jonathan. It was clear that she felt alive in this new space, more recognized, more heard. Jonathan admired that. He never cut her off. On the contrary, he made a point of showing support. Elena's promotion brought new responsibilities and, with them, a closer relationship with the company's regional director, a man named Thomas, experienced, eloquent, known for his charisma and ability to conduct negotiations with firmness and sympathy. He soon noticed Elena's talent and began involving her in more strategic decisions, inviting her to meetings that were not previously part of her schedule. Jonathan met him during a company awards event and, as always, maintained his discreet and cordial demeanor. Thomas was polite, even friendly, and Elena introduced him with a sparkle in her eyes typical of someone who feels proud to be valued by someone of influence. Jonathan noticed, but did not judge. He trusted her. Over time, their schedules began to get out of alignment. Elena arrived late, explained that she was tired again, kept her cell phone closer, sometimes facing down, and said she was too exhausted for long conversations. Jonathan, who had always been attentive to details, noticed the subtle changes, but chose to remain silent. He attributed it all to the pressure of his new position. He himself had gone through similar phases, when work seemed to take over everything. Still, there were times when the silence between them became thick, and the touch between them seemed just a repetition of old gestures. Despite this, Jonathan did not stop loving her. On the contrary, he began to care for her even more. He prepared simple dinners for when she came home late, he left notes around the house, loving messages on meeting days. He tried to rekindle, with small gestures, the flame that he felt was fading without knowing exactly why. And Elena, sometimes, responded. Some nights, she would lie down next to him with a tenderness that seemed to say, "I'm still here," and Jonathan allowed himself to believe it. Even when she was far away, there was still sweetness in her gestures, and he clung to that with a strength that he himself did not understand. On the other hand, Elena's work required new things from her. Thomas, besides being a director, was engaging. He knew how to recognize merits, gave compliments with surgical precision, knew the boundaries between the professional and the personal, and sometimes, crossed them with subtlety. Elena was never naive. She knew when she was being watched. She knew when a comment went beyond what was necessary. But she also knew how to defend herself. Or she thought she did. The invitations to closed-door meetings, the smiles that lingered a little longer, the jokes between colleagues who mentioned her name when she walked by, all of this began to emerge slowly, almost imperceptibly. But it was there. And over time, Elena began to walk more cautiously. At home, the weekends continued. Jonathan organized little outings, dinners with old friends, wine nights and old movies. He tried to maintain the thread that united them, even though he felt, somewhere in his chest, that the knot was no longer the same. There was a shadow. Something subtle, but real. As if between each word exchanged there was an absence that no one wanted to name. Her eyes were still smiling, but the smile no longer touched the corners of her mouth. Jonathan tried to decipher, but never accused. He respected, even when it hurt. And then came the dinner. The one that would bring together the entire board, leadership and employees in a celebration of the company's growth. It was supposed to be a night of achievements. Elena invited him enthusiastically, as she did on important occasions. She said it would be good for both of them, that he would be able to get to know his colleagues better. Jonathan accepted, of course. He put on his best suit, arranged his hair more carefully, and perfumed himself with the fragrance she said was her favorite. He wanted her to be proud of him as he was proud of her. That night, the two arrived together. Elena in a dark dress, discreet makeup, hair tied elegantly. Jonathan looked at her as if he still saw the woman he had met on their first date. And for a while, everything seemed normal. Smiles, toasts, pleasant conversations. The room pulsed with light and ambient music. Thomas was there too, greeting everyone, circulating as an informal host. When he reached them, he greeted Jonathan with a firm handshake and turned his gaze to Elena for a second longer. Jonathan saw. Felt. But he didn't react. Dinner continued, and between glasses and speeches, laughter and thanks, Jonathan began to feel something different. A nuisance that I didn't know where it came from. Maybe the tone of Elena's voice when talking to Thomas. Perhaps the glances exchanged amidst the hubbub. Or maybe it was just fear setting in. But something was out of place. Something he couldn't name, but it made him uneasy. And it was there, in that space of uncertainty, that everything began to change. Still not knowing what was coming next, Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, feeling the ground beneath his feet more carefully. That night would not end as it began. But that, at that moment, no one knew yet. The hall was full, but for Jonathan everything felt narrower, as if the air was escaping through some invisible crack. The laughter sounded forced, the applause seemed distant, and the sound of silverware was louder than any conversation around him. He watched Elena's every movement, every gesture, every pause between words spoken with almost automatic charm. She moved among her colleagues as if she had been born for that environment that was no longer strange to her. And Thomas. Thomas orbited around her like someone who feels like he owns something he didn't buy, but took for himself out of mere convenience. Jonathan's gaze followed the two of them, and although he tried to convince himself that everything was normal, his stomach turned with every laugh Elena let out when Thomas whispered something in her ear. For much of dinner, Jonathan remained quiet, observant. He wasn't one for explosive gestures, he never was. He always preferred silent analysis, time as an ally. But there was something in the air that was eating away at him inside. A chill down his spine that didn't come from the air conditioning or the ice-cold wine he was trying to drink to calm down. Time dragged on and, even though he tried to interact with other guests, his focus remained on the two of them. The way she touched his arm when she laughed. The way he leaned in to speak closer than necessary. Her hands, restless. His hands, confidently invasive. Small things that in isolation could be ignored, but together formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. On the way home, the silence was absolute. Elena looked tired, but she didn't say anything. Jonathan didn't either. He just drove, his hands steady on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, as if every kilometer closer to the house gate was a test of emotional endurance. When they got inside, she took off her heels and went straight to her room, saying she needed to rest. Jonathan stayed in the living room for a while, staring at the half-drunk glass of wine he had brought from dinner. The night had left a bitter taste in him, and it wasn't from the wine. He went upstairs a little later and found Elena already lying down, her back to him, breathing deeply as if she wanted to avoid conversation. He lay down next to her, but sleep wouldn't come. Only doubts. In the days that followed, Jonathan began to notice other signs. Elena spent more time on her cell phone, smiling at the screen with a delicacy that he no longer saw reserved for him. I left for work earlier and came back later. She started using a different perfume, more striking, bolder. Her clothes were more refined, her makeup more elaborate. She said she needed to stand out, to be up to the new commitments and responsibilities. Jonathan, for his part, tried to pretend he believed it. But each new detail was like a small wound that, no matter how much he wanted to ignore it, was bleeding inside. It was on a Tuesday, while I was ironing in the silence of the living room, that something changed. Her cell phone vibrated on the table. A message. He wasn't the type to pry into other people's lives, much less that of the woman he shared years of his life with. But at that moment, in that solitude, curiosity won over morality. He read it. It was a simple but accurate message. Last night was hard to forget. I can still taste you. Jonathan felt the blood rush to his feet. His breath caught. The words seemed to scream on the phone's display. The message came from a number saved with only initials. But he knew. Of course I knew. The heart recognizes the threats that the mind wants to avoid. He didn't confront Elena at that moment. He kept the information to himself. But at that moment, something changed inside him. Pain gave way to strategy. Over the next few days, he sought to understand more. He observed. He asked subtle questions. He checked her behavior. He looked for other clues, with the caution of someone who needs to know the truth. And they came. Restaurant receipts from nights when she said she was in long meetings. An earring that wasn't hers lost in her purse. Traces of a different perfume on the seat of the car she said she had left for repairs. Little lies strung together too quickly. Jonathan then began to put the puzzle together. One Friday was the turning point. Elena had an essential company event. She said she would be back late, perhaps not until the next day, because the team was going to do an immersion to present results in another city. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He just nodded and wished her a good trip. When she left, he took action. He contacted an acquaintance who worked at the same company, someone he knew to be discreet. In less than 2 hours, he confirmed, there was no event. Nothing official. Nothing scheduled. Jonathan now knew that he was facing the reality he had avoided so much. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion but a certainty. But it wasn't time to explode yet. He needed to see it. He needed the image that would forever record the end of what they had built together. And he got it. He waited until nightfall and, using the tracker he had discreetly installed in her car weeks ago, he drove to a hotel downtown. The same one that had already appeared on the receipts. He waited for hours inside the car, discreetly parked. And then he saw her. Getting out of the car calmly, wearing simple clothes, with a serene face. Accompanied by him. Thomas. The same one who had greeted him at dinner with a cordial handshake. The two of them went in without rushing, as if they were repeating that naturally. Jonathan didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His pain was now his alone. And there, in the silence of that parking lot, a decision began to form. Not about Elena. Not about Thomas. But about himself. About what he would do with the truth. About how he would use everything he knew. There was still something else. A detail he had discovered in the weeks of investigation, something that could turn this betrayal into something even more devastating. A secret. A fact that changed not only the narrative, but the very essence of what people thought of him. That, he would keep for a while longer. The next day, Elena returned home late in the afternoon, carrying her suitcase with ease. She said that the immersion had been productive. Jonathan greeted her with a kiss on the forehead. He smiled. He prepared dinner. And during the meal, he asked her how the work had gone. She answered with invented details. And he listened attentively. He knew that silence was her greatest weapon at that moment. And that the real impact was yet to come. Deep down, Elena still believed that he was the same as before. And that was exactly what would make everything even more painful. In the days that followed, Jonathan prepared the ground. He gathered evidence. He organized documents. He edited images. He recorded audio. He created dossiers. Each file was an open wound turned into a strategy. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. He wanted the truth to be seen. And more than that, he wanted everyone to see who Elena and Thomas really were. For there to be no doubt. For there to be no room for excuses. And then came the company dinner. The new one. The quarterly celebration. The perfect occasion. Elena had invited him, as always. And he had accepted. He had dressed as carefully as before, but with a look in his eyes that she could not decipher. They had arrived together. Smiles, toasts, speeches. Everything was as before. Until, everything stopped. And in that split second, as the entire room fell silent at the unexpected gesture, Jonathan was certain that the end had finally begun. What would come next would be irreversible. But the most devastating part was yet to be revealed. The music stopped, the conversations evaporated, and silence took over the room like an eclipse. The dry sound of the forced kiss reverberated like a gunshot, a crack tearing through the bubble of hypocrisy that had until then sustained that facade of elegance. Jonathan's eyes remained fixed, not on Thomas, nor on Elena, but on the exact spot where his lips touched her face. It was only a second, maybe two, but it lasted long enough to rewrite the last years of her life in red ink. The gesture was not one of affection, nor of passion. It was territorial. And what hurt Jonathan the most was not the act itself, but her lack of reaction. She did not back away, did not say a word, she simply accepted it, as if it were already common, as if he already had the right. And everyone around, witnessed it. No one intervened. The collective embarrassment turned into immobility. Jonathan stood up without saying anything, walked to the door and disappeared into the night without looking back. The next morning, Elena arrived home and found him sitting on the couch, dressed simply, calm as a man on the edge of an abyss, but who had already accepted his fall. She tried to start a conversation, asked if he wanted coffee, tried to smile as if what had happened the night before was less serious than it seemed. But when she looked into his eyes, she understood. Jonathan was no longer the same man. Not the one who avoided confrontation, who preferred silence to war. He looked at her for several seconds and simply said that he needed to talk. She sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly. And he began. Without raising his voice, without losing control, he told her that he knew everything. About the messages, the nights in hotels, the lunches that she said were meetings, the clothes she had exchanged in the car, the cheap perfume that wasn't hers and that he recognized on Thomas's own shirt. Elena tried to deny it, but he interrupted her. He said he didn't want an explanation. He just wanted her to listen. And that's when everything changed. Jonathan stood, walked over to the bookshelf, picked up a manila envelope, and placed it on the table. Inside were copies of emails, photos, transcripts of messages, everything documented. Every betrayal, every lie. Her face drained of color. Her throat went dry. She tried to form a sentence, but shame weighed more heavily than any justification. He watched her for a moment, then spoke of something he had kept to himself until then. He said he had discovered something bigger, something that involved more than their marriage. Something that, if revealed, would destroy not only Thomas's career but also the image she believed herself to have. It was at this point that Elena really turned pale. Jonathan then revealed that, during his silent investigation, he discovered that the meetings between her and Thomas were not just personal. There was illicit professional involvement. Thomas had promoted Elena using funds diverted from the company's budget, manipulating campaign results to favor projects led by her. What's more, he used his relationship with Elena to influence corporate decisions that directly impacted competitors within the company itself. Elena, in turn, had signed false reports. She had access to privileged information. She thought she was just involved with an influential man, but without knowing it, she had become an accomplice in a scheme that was now being investigated internally by the company itself, and that Jonathan had helped to anonymously denounce weeks earlier. She remained silent, her eyes filled with tears, her breathing heavy. She tried to deny it, but he took out the second envelope. In it was a copy of a dossier given to the company's compliance department. Detailed, with dates, amounts, transactions, times, witnesses. The investigation was still confidential, but it had already been opened. Thomas would be called to testify soon. And so would she. Elena put her hands to her mouth, as if she wanted to swallow what she had done. She said she didn't know. That she never wanted to hurt anyone. That everything was getting mixed up, that he was persuasive, that she just wanted recognition. Jonathan listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said that it was no longer his problem. And that, from that moment on, she would have to deal with the consequences. He got up, went to his room and came back with a packed suitcase. He said he didn't expect her to understand or forgive him, because he didn't understand or forgive him either. He said that, at that moment, what hurt the most was not the betrayal, but the lack of true remorse. That she wasn't crying for what she had done, but for what she was going to lose. And that, for him, was the most unforgivable thing. Before leaving, he left a document on the table, the formal request for divorce, with clearly defined clauses about the division of assets, legal support and the waiver of any reconciliation. Elena tried to get closer, to touch him, but he pulled away. He said that now their love had turned into a memory. And that he didn't want to live trapped in a past that only existed in his head. In the following days, the effects of the scandal began to appear. Thomas was temporarily removed from his position. The company's internal press published a note investigating unethical conduct by the regional leadership. Elena was suspended from her duties. Colleagues avoided her. The previously admiring looks became judgmental. She began to be seen not only as the woman who had gotten involved with her boss, but as a double traitor, to her professional ethics and to her own home. Social media began to speculate, message groups commented. The house that had once been a home became a field of silence and tension. Elena slept badly, ate little, and avoided going out. Meanwhile, Jonathan started over. He moved to a small, simple apartment, but with a wide view, just as he always wanted. He enrolled in an emotional coaching training course, not because he wanted to change professions, but because he wanted to understand himself. She started attending a support group for people who had experienced marital betrayal, and there she discovered something she hadn't expected: empathy. He found more tragic stories, pains that mirrored his own, and there, for the first time, he felt heard. And it was during one of these sessions, on a Sunday afternoon, that he met Laura, a recently graduated psychologist, who was also participating as a volunteer in the group. They talked, had coffee after the sessions, exchanged books. There was no rush. There was no anxiety. There was only presence. And for the first time in months, Jonathan smiled effortlessly. But the biggest impact was yet to come. A month later, Jonathan received a call from Elena's legal department. The investigation had made progress. The evidence he had provided had been crucial. When confronted, Thomas tried to shift the blame onto Elena. He said she was fully aware of everything. That they had been together for longer than they were saying. That she was actively benefiting from the scheme. Elena was called to testify. As she left the internal hearing room, her eyes searched for him. But Jonathan was no longer there. He had already finished his part. He had delivered the truth. And with it, freed himself. What no one knew, and what Elena didn't know, was that Jonathan had one last card. One last detail. Something that, if revealed, would change not only everyone's view of her, but of him as well. A secret he kept like a shield. A fact that could completely change the game if she tried to play the victim. And now, seeing how she reacted to the fall, how she desperately tried to redeem herself without really taking the blame, he knew the moment was coming. The moment to reveal something that could completely destroy any illusion that remained. Because there was something in their past, something she thought he never discovered, but he did. And he was about to show the world. The week after Elena's testimony, the city seemed smaller. She walked the streets with short steps, avoiding glances, turning her face away even from strangers. His image, once associated with efficiency and charisma, was now the subject of hushed whispers and social distancing. Friendships that seemed solid crumbled like houses of cards in the face of the gale of truth. The phone calls stopped, the invitations disappeared, and even the family itself reduced the frequency of visits. Her parents, who had her as an example, began to treat her with a painful coldness, not out of anger, but out of shame. Her older sister, ever protective, limited conversations to short sentences and dry messages. She began to avoid mirrors, because the woman she saw reflected in her no longer seemed familiar. It was as if she had lost not only Jonathan, but herself as well. Thomas, on the other hand, was facing consequences on a different scale. His removal from office had become a formal dismissal, and the company announced a radical restructuring of its leadership department. He tried to contact Elena several times, but she wouldn't answer. Deep down, he knew that she had been used as a shield when the house fell apart. It was more convenient to portray her as an accomplice than to admit that everything had been orchestrated by him from the beginning. Thomas's name began to circulate on corporate discussion boards as an example of what not to do. Industry magazines quietly commented on the scandal. No specific details were given, but the signs were there. He was burned in the market, and there was no connection strong enough to save him. Meanwhile, Jonathan allowed himself a different silence. A silence that no longer came from pain, but from reconstruction. He started going to cafes he hadn't been to before, visiting places he had always been curious about but had put off until later. Laura, with her unpretentious lightness, became more and more present, but without forcing any step. He admired the way she listened to him without trying to solve his pain, just validating each feeling with honest and welcoming listening. They began walking together at dusk, and on one of those walks, Jonathan decided he was ready to tell the whole truth, the last part of the story, the one he still kept to himself. It was a gray afternoon, and they were sitting on a park bench, watching the leaves swirl in the wind. Laura was holding a cup of coffee, and Jonathan, after a long silence, took a deep breath before starting. He said that, months before discovering the betrayal, he had received an anonymous email with suspicious information about financial transactions within the company where Elena worked. At first, he thought it was some kind of scam or mistake, but he decided to investigate. With each new discovery, he realized that there was something much bigger going on. Not just an extramarital affair, but a structure set up to divert funds and manipulate results. The most shocking thing, however, came when he cross-referenced the data with an old case. He discovered that Thomas had already been investigated for unethical conduct at another company, and that, on that occasion, an employee had been fired for covering up his actions. That employee, he later discovered, was Elena's sister. Laura stared at him in silence, surprised by the revelation. Jonathan continued. He said he didn't believe in coincidences. He knew that Elena's sister had worked with Thomas for years, and when he first mentioned his name, in a casual conversation, her reaction had been different. Too quick. Too restrained. It was then that he understood that perhaps Elena had known who Thomas was all along. That perhaps, just perhaps, she hadn't been seduced, but rather, complicit. Laura held his hand. Jonathan didn't speak with resentment. He spoke with sadness. With the pain of someone who has accepted that love is sometimes tainted by ambitions that we pretend not to see. He decided to confront Elena once more, not for revenge, but because he needed to understand. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, far from the eyes of the city. She arrived on time, exhausted, her face thinner, her expression tired. She sat down with a defensive posture, but silent. He began by asking if she remembered the story of her sister and Thomas. She hesitated, then nodded. She said yes, that she had heard, but she thought there was no connection. Jonathan looked into her eyes and asked if, deep down, she had known who he was from the beginning. Elena took her time, bit her lip, looked away. She said yes, that she had suspected, but that at the time she thought it could be different. That she herself would be different. That she wanted to stand out, to show that she was more than the shadow of someone who had already failed. That she would not get involved. But she did. And when she realized, she was too deep in it to turn back. She cried. For the first time, she really cried. She said that what hurt her most was not having lost her position, her prestige, or even her reputation. It was having betrayed those who loved her and still having insisted on lying to protect something that was already rotten. Jonathan listened to everything. He didn't say he forgave her. He didn't say he hated her either. He just said he understood now. That understanding isn't the same as accepting. And that forgiving isn't the same as coming back. She thanked him. She said she needed to hear that. And that she didn't expect redemption, but maybe a little peace. He smiled sadly. He got up and left. He didn't look back. That same day, he sent an email to the company's legal department with an attachment, a complete report on the old relationship between Thomas and Elena's sister, including records, cross-references, and contracts. He knew it was the missing piece to close the circle. After that, he deleted all the files related to the case. He kept only one photo. An old picture of a walk with Elena, before everything. Not to remember the pain, but to remember who he was before everything fell apart. Time passed. Jonathan and Laura grew closer naturally. No urgency, no labels. Just presence. Their meetings became a light routine. Unrestricted conversations, comfortable silences. One day, while they were walking by the lake, Laura said that she admired the way he dealt with loss. That there was beauty in not letting pain turn him into someone bitter. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe without regret. Not because he had forgotten, but because he knew how to turn the end into a new beginning. Elena, in turn, moved to another state. He restarted his career in a modest way. He now works in a small office with no leadership positions. He lives discreetly, rarely posts photos, and hardly participates in social groups. The shame still accompanies her, but now there is also a silent desire to be someone better. One rainy night, he wrote an email to Jonathan. He didn't ask for forgiveness. "I would just say thank you." She said that, as cruel as the end was, it had saved her from becoming a worse version of herself. Jonathan read the message and did not respond. Not out of contempt, but because he understood that some stories don't need an epilogue. Just silence. And silence is sometimes the most powerful way to say you've moved on. The days following Jonathan and Elena's last meeting unfolded at a strange pace, as if time were moving cautiously, aware of the weight that each minute carried. Jonathan no longer sought justifications, nor did he need to reorganize the facts within his own mind. Everything had already been absorbed, digested in silence, and transformed into a dense tranquility, which carried a sober melancholy. But it was not the end. There were still traces, consequences that do not cease just because someone decided to close a chapter. There was a story being rewritten every day, a plot where the characters now bore visible and invisible scars, and the world around them reacted to these marks in unexpected ways. Laura remained by his side, but she did not occupy the space as a substitute. She understood his silences, the long pauses between sentences, the way he hesitated before smiling for real. She did not demand feelings that were still being rebuilt, and so Jonathan allowed himself to be in her presence with serenity. He did not love Laura as he had loved Elena, and perhaps he never would. But there was something new between them, a pure respect, a silent complicity that did not require declarations. There was comfort, and sometimes, that alone is enough. Still, inside Jonathan, something was unsettling. It was not regret. It was a moral doubt that insisted on surviving even after the storm. Because, despite everything, there was a line he had crossed, and he knew it. By handing over the final dossier, by exposing not only Thomas but also Elena's sister's past and its silent connection to the unfolding of the present, Jonathan carried an ethical burden that he was still learning to deal with. Not because what he did was wrong, but because he knew he had done it out of a darker impulse than he cared to admit. It was justice, yes. But it was also punishment. He didn't just want to free himself, he wanted to make his mark. He wanted to make it clear that he would never be forgotten as the man who had been betrayed, but as the man who had exposed, who had laid bare every lie with a precision that hurt. And that realization kept him awake some nights. Elena, on the other hand, was rebuilding herself in ruins. The first few months in her new city were spent in almost complete isolation. She found a small apartment in a peripheral neighborhood, where no one recognized her, where her past seemed less suffocating. She worked at a medium-sized communications agency, without leadership positions, excessive responsibility, or prominence. She did the basics, but she did them well. She relearned to respect time and silence. Little by little, she reconnected with her sister, from whom she had also distanced herself after the revelation of her previous involvement with Thomas. The reunion between the two was tough, but necessary. It was on a Sunday, unprepared, unrehearsed. The conversation began with bitter accusations and ended with a dry, hurtful hug, but it was a start. Elena's parents, on the other hand, remained cold, as if they still didn't know how to deal with the new version of their daughter. She understood. She no longer sought their forgiveness in desperation. Now, she knew that some disappointments take too long to be erased with words alone. So, she started writing. She kept a diary where she recorded every thought, every regret, every flash of memory that insisted on appearing. Not to justify what she did, but to understand why she allowed everything to get to that point. She began to understand that the betrayal didn't start when she crossed the line with Thomas. It started much earlier, when she began to measure her worth only by the eyes of others. When she believed that success had to be achieved at any cost. When she allowed ambition to take the place of ethics, when emotional neediness was confused with power. Meanwhile, Jonathan was invited to participate in a panel on professional ethics organized by a university. He was hesitant at first, but Laura encouraged him to go. She said that sometimes pain, when transformed into words, can be useful to someone. He accepted. At the event, he did not reveal names or mention dates, but he told his story with maturity. He spoke about how small daily concessions to silence and comfort zone can cost dearly. How omission, even disguised as patience, can also destroy. He was applauded. Some young people approached him later to thank him. Others shared similar stories. And there, Jonathan realized that, even without wanting to, he had become a voice for something greater than his own tragedy. A few days later, she received a letter. It was handwritten. It was from Elena. She didn't ask for reconciliation, she didn't try to reverse anything. She simply said that she had found her sister again, that she now understood the silences of the past and that, above all, she no longer sought external forgiveness. She said that she finally understood that the most difficult forgiveness was the one she needed to grant herself. And that he, Jonathan, had shown her this without knowing it. At the end of the letter, there was a highlighted sentence, written in large, firm letters: "The truth hurts, but lies corrode. And I have let lies define me for too long." Jonathan read the letter 3 times before putting it in a box along with other fragments of what had been. Life went on. Laura was promoted and invited to participate in a social project in another city. Jonathan encouraged her to accept, even though he knew that the distance could cool what they were building. She accepted, but before leaving, they talked at length. They agreed that what they had experienced together was essential, it was healing, it was transition. That there was no need to force a future. That their present had already been more than enough. She kissed him on the forehead, promised to keep in touch, and left. Jonathan did not cry. He smiled. He knew that this story was not a loss, but a cycle that was closing with tenderness. Months later, he published an article. It was a reflection on choices, on truths avoided, on the ability to reinvent oneself after destruction. The text went viral. He received messages from readers all over the world. Stories of pain, of overcoming, of mistakes and new beginnings. Jonathan was now more than a betrayed man. He was an example that even the most bitter truths can turn into liberation. But even with all this reconstruction, there was still a silent doubt, a dilemma that whispered in the quietest nights: to what extent was the exposure necessary? To what extent would silence have been nobler? He didn't regret revealing the truth, but he wondered if there was too much pleasure in having won. He had fed on a pain that, in the end, also corrupted him a little. Because when someone destroys a castle with their own hands, even if it is infested with lies, it is impossible not to come out covered in rubble. And now, life was moving towards something new. There were no concrete plans, no new immediate passions. But there was peace. And a sincere desire to continue being someone better. What would come next, he didn't know. But he knew that, when it happened, he would be ready. Because he had learned that falling is not the end, and that sometimes what seemed like ruin was just the beginning of a new path. Winter came early that year, and the cold seemed to accurately reflect what still remained frozen inside Jonathan. The season didn't scare him. In fact, he was always the kind of man who enjoyed the silence of cloudy mornings, the sidewalks covered in dry leaves and the smell of hot coffee mixing with the humid air. What was bothering me now was the feeling that everything had been said and done, but something still remained in suspense, as if the story refused to have a definitive end. Jonathan no longer carried guilt or desire for revenge, but there was a strange emptiness, not of loneliness, but of unspoken conclusions, of echoes of conversations that needed to happen so that the past could finally be buried with honor. He kept writing. The text had become his therapy, his confessional. He published some articles regularly, and others he kept to himself. One quiet morning, as he was reviewing some old notes, he noticed a line highlighted in one of his early notebooks of rants: "I am not what they did to me, I am what I choose to do with it." He read it out loud and, for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to smile to himself. But that was the same day that something unexpected happened. He received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end of the line was soft, slightly shaky, and it took him a few seconds to recognize it. It was Helena, Elena's sister. The surprise was not only in the contact itself, but in the reason. She said she needed to see him, that there was something that could no longer be kept silent. Jonathan hesitated. Not out of fear or discomfort, but because he had already accepted that some loose ends would remain that way. However, there was something in her voice that seemed sincere, urgent, as if this had also been weighing on his shoulders for too long. He agreed to the meeting. They arranged to meet in a discreet restaurant, away from the busy centers, where they could talk in privacy. Helena arrived with firm steps, but her gaze carried the same insecurity that Jonathan remembered from the few times they had seen each other. They did not exchange hugs or unnecessary formalities. They sat across from each other and immediately delved into the subject. She began by telling Elena that she had lied to her years ago about what had really happened with Thomas at the old company. She said that not only had she been involved, but that she had initiated the approach, seduced him, believing that she could use his influence to advance. When everything fell apart, she took the blame alone, protecting Thomas. And more than that, she asked Elena never to mention the subject, for fear of tarnishing the family name. What Helena revealed, however, went beyond what Jonathan had expected to hear. She said that, months before Elena met Thomas professionally, she herself had suggested his name as a reference for a project at the company where Elena worked. Not out of malice, but because she believed that he, with his smooth talk and confident demeanor, could help her grow more quickly. Elena was reluctant, but she trusted her sister. What she didn't know, and only discovered later, was that Thomas still maintained a certain control over Helena, who still felt emotionally tied to that toxic past and had never truly overcome the role she played in that story. When Jonathan appeared in Elena's life with his tranquility and constancy, Helena felt envious. Not of the relationship, but of the peace. And perhaps because of that, she unconsciously opened the door for Elena to repeat a pattern disguised as an opportunity. Jonathan listened in silence. He felt like someone finally accessing the last piece of a very long puzzle. Anger did not come. No sadness. Just a bitter understanding of how lives become intertwined and corrupted by the choices of others. Helena finished by apologizing. She said she didn't expect to be forgiven, but that she needed to look him in the eye and admit what she had done, even if it was late. Jonathan held the napkin on the table for a few seconds, observing its texture, as if there was something more important there than the words he needed to find. He then said there was no more room for judgment. That the pain had already been processed, and that the truth, although late, was still worthy. He thanked her for her sincerity, got up and left without looking back. On the way home, I thought about how much we carry stories that are not just ours. And that even when we forgive or are forgiven, what matters most is what we decide to do with what we have learned. That night he wrote late into the night. And on a new impulse, he decided to send an email to Elena. Not to reopen wounds, nor to resume conversations, but to offer something that until then he didn't know he could give, a dignified closure. In the body of the email, he simply wrote that he now understood what had previously seemed incomprehensible. Who didn't agree with her choices, but understood her roots. And he hoped she had found some form of peace too. He did not sign with resentment, nor with irony. Only with the name that had been his for so many years, and that he could now finally carry without the weight of an unresolved past. Elena replied 2 days later. It was a short message. I was grateful for the maturity, for the courage to not perpetuate the cycle of pain. He said he now understood that the consequences of our choices are not always immediate, but that they do arrive. And their arrival is what defines whether we will continue to be who we were or who we chose to be from then on. Jonathan read the message more than once before archiving it. Over time, he began traveling again. Visit small towns, go on light trails, reconnect with old people and find pieces of yourself that you had forgotten. He began to give lectures more frequently. Some at universities, others at community meetings. He was talking about rebuilding, about emotional ethics, about how what destroys a marriage rarely starts in the bedroom, but rather in the daily abandonment of small loyalties. One spring afternoon, he met Laura again. She had returned to visit family and decided to look for him. They met in a bright cafe, and the reunion was natural, without tension, without expectations. They talked for hours. They laughed at old jokes, talked about news, and at the end, they exchanged a long hug. She said he seemed lighter, more whole. He replied that he finally felt that way. Laura left the next day, and Jonathan didn't try to hold back the moment. He knew that some stories only work when the time is right, and that theirs had served its purpose. And now, with everything calmer, Jonathan lived without rushing. Still alone, but complete. Still reflective, but open. And one afternoon, while organizing books on the shelf, he found the letter that Elena had written months ago. He read it one last time, with a different perspective. Then, gently, he tore it into small pieces and threw them in the trash. Not out of contempt, but because I could finally move forward without carrying anything in my hands. No weight on your shoulders. No voices from the past whispering in the dark. Now it was just him. And life, finally, waiting for what was yet to come. Time followed its course with the silent precision of old clocks, and the months that followed the revelations, confrontations, and departures did not exactly bring healing, but rather the understanding that some wounds do not heal with time, they just stop bleeding. Jonathan did not return to where he started, but built another path, a new road, where each step was taken with the awareness of someone who had already stumbled in the dark. His life, now, was marked by lighter choices, intentional gestures, and silences that did not hide hurts, but cultivated peace. The last time he heard about Elena was from third parties. He learned that she had distanced herself even further from her old network of contacts, exchanging advertising for language classes at a modest school. She avoided leadership positions, refused invitations to corporate events, and lived almost anonymously, as if seeking refuge not from others, but from herself. Elena, in turn, never returned to the image of a brilliant and admired woman that she maintained for years. However, victimization was not allowed either. He took responsibility for his mistakes with bitterness, but without pretending to be instantly redeemed. She didn't romanticize the process. He knew he had destroyed not only the love he had received, but also the trust that supported his professional identity. The greatest punishment, however, came not from people, but from conscience. Sleeping became an exercise in coping, as each night she was visited by memories of the life she had and the choices she had made. He tried to find answers in readings, in psychotherapy, in silent retreats, but deep down he knew that what he needed most was to learn to live with the truth. What hurt the most wasn't losing Jonathan, it was knowing that he hadn't lost her, he'd left her. Thomas, the man who once believed himself untouchable, tried every way to get back on his feet, use old contacts, exploit legal loopholes and rebuild his career. But his reputation was not made up of rumors alone, it was made up of facts, and these facts never fade away. With each attempt to find a new job, a new obstacle arose, a new anonymous email, a new rejection. He discovered that the influence he thought he had evaporated the moment he lost the respect of his peers. His friends drifted away, not out of morals, but out of fear of association. He tried to invest in his own business, but his lack of credibility scuttled any possibility of investment. Within a few years, he was forced to drastically reduce his standard of living. He sold his apartment, moved to a less expensive neighborhood and began teaching temporary classes in technical courses, where he rarely revealed his real background. He was never seen at elegant dinners or in magazine columns again. He became an ordinary man, and that was his greatest defeat. Helena, Elena's sister, took the hardest path. After revealing to Jonathan his share of responsibility, he faced his own shame for having fueled, albeit indirectly, the destruction of a story that was not his. It took months before she was able to look in the mirror and say firmly that she was no longer the woman who tried to manipulate other people's fates. He rebuilt his relationship with Elena through small gestures, short conversations, exchanges of silence full of meaning. They never apologized in so many words, but each other's presence became enough. Helena married years later a simple man, different from all the others she had idealized in the past. A man who taught her that emotional security is not built with games, but with truth. And, curiously, it was with him that she understood for the first time what fearless love was. Jonathan, over the years, has undergone subtle but profound transformations. His name began to circulate at conferences as a reference for ethics and resilience. He was invited to participate in a documentary about interpersonal relationships and became one of the mentors of a group that supported people dealing with traumatic marital losses. He never considered himself a hero. I knew that it also had its dark moments, that the exposure of the truth, although fair, was also born from poorly digested pain. But he never denied it. On the contrary, he made a point of emphasizing that his reconstruction was not about overcoming, but about humility. One day, during a lecture, a woman in the audience asked him if he had fallen in love again. Jonathan paused for a second, smiled and replied, "I have learned to love silently. Myself. After that, any other love that comes will be a consequence, not salvation." He never married again. He had other relationships, some brief, others deep, but in all of them he maintained the firmness of someone who no longer fears loneliness. In the end, he chose a lighter life, surrounded by sincere people, simple moments and the freedom of not having to prove anything to anyone. His home became a welcoming place, where friends would stop by to chat, where books would pile up next to the fireplace and where he would write every night, as if he were still stitching together the loose ends of his own soul. And then, one morning, while he was drinking his coffee and sorting his mail, he received an envelope. Inside was a simple letter, written in familiar handwriting. It was from Elena. In it, she said she was moving to another country, where she would teach literature to children. She said that, for the first time, she felt like she was experiencing something real. At the end of the letter, there was just one sentence: "You were my best choice. I was your worst. But still, thank you." Jonathan read it and stood there, motionless. He felt something slipping inside, but it wasn't pain. It was just the realization that everything had come to an end. For the first time, he felt like he could leave everything there. That there were no more loose ends, no more letters, no more questions. And then, as if in a ritual gesture, he put the letter in the drawer and went for a walk, feeling the wind blow on his face like someone who finally understands that the past no longer weighs on him. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Would you have done it differently? Comment below, your opinion is very important to us. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now. Every week we bring you real or fictional stories that show the consequences of what is often ignored: betrayal. This channel does not support any type of infidelity. Here, we show how the truth, even if it is hard, is always the best path. Thank you for listening until the end. Until the next story.